The trade war between the United States and China continues to escalate, and the threat of the invasion of Taiwan keeps the relationship between the two countries at one of the most tense moments in their history, with Xi Jinping unveiling his plan for the yuan to replace the dollar as the world's main currency and give the United States a fatal blow in this war. But will he be able to achieve his goal? The tensions that began with the trade war between China and the United States during Donald Trump's presidency have evolved into a second version of the Cold War, where China's intention to recover Taiwan has revealed that a confrontation between the two nations could be just a matter of time. And while the United States has focused its efforts on limiting China's access to microchips to prevent its use in advanced weapons technology and hit it economically, making it harder to wage war, China has been focusing its efforts on ending the dominance of the dollar to damage the U.S. economy and make it difficult to give Taiwan any military support. But although Taiwan has been at the center of everything, if it sank into the sea tomorrow, these tensions would likely not disappear. But why does Xi Jinping want to focus on destroying the dominance of the dollar? The reason is because of the two great advantages that it gives to its rival. The first advantage is that due to its high demand worldwide, the United States can create a large amount of this currency without causing inflation, allowing it to maintain high fiscal deficits that it covers with debt for which it pays very low interest. And the second is because it gives the United States enormous power over the international economy by being able to freeze the dollar reserves of other countries or isolate them from the predominantly dollar-based international trade system. Because 60% of the international reserves of the central banks are in dollars, around 3 times those that are in euros. 88% of the transactions in foreign exchange markets involve the dollar, and around 60 to 65% of the transactions in international trade are carried out in dollars. All of these factors contribute to forming virtuous circles that strengthen the position of the dollar. The fact that it is widely accepted as a currency throughout the world makes it more likely to be received. Its widespread usage in currency markets leads to low spread, making it a more attractive choice for transactions. The possibility of using it in a highly developed financial market offering numerous instruments with good liquidity further increases the currency's appeal and reinforces its dominance in the market. All this translates into more demand, which gives the dollar more strength and makes it a better option than other currencies in the long term if these conditions continue, something that of course Xi Jinping will seek to change. But before I tell you how, it is good to make a couple of clarifications about the monetary system, which will help you better understand Xi Jinping's plan. The first clarification is that for 50 years most countries in the world have adopted the fiat monetary system, where currencies are not backed by raw materials as was the case with gold before. Neither the dollar, nor the euro, nor the yen, yuan, or ruble are backed by gold. This often leads to the saying that currencies are backed by trust, which is a somewhat ambiguous definition of value that can be changed to demand. The value of a currency, in the current system, is determined mainly by the demand it has and where acceptability, usability, liquidity, and investability, among other characteristics, converge. The second clarification is that although central banks hold gold in their reserves, it is important to differentiate this from their currencies being backed by gold. The Federal Reserve is the central bank with the largest gold reserves in the world, followed by the European Central Bank, the Russian Central Bank, and the Central Bank of China, but neither the dollar, euro, ruble, or yuan are gold-backed currencies. These reserves, like international reserves, are used as a way to stabilize their own currency. For example, the Central Bank of Japan used its international reserves in dollars to buy the yen and mitigate the sharp fall that this currency had against the dollar during 2022. And the third clarification is that the price of any currency varies daily, and as I mentioned in our previous video, the fall in the price of the dollar in recent months should not be interpreted as the end of its status as a reserve currency, but rather was due to expectations of the market in the short term, and if inflation increases it is likely that it will rise in price, regardless of Xi Jinping's plans, which even if they work, would be seen in years and not months. Xi Jinping's plan aims to break the virtuous circles of the dollar, with the yuan positioning itself as a potential replacement. To achieve this, China has set its sights on disrupting the market for perhaps the world's most important commodity, crude oil. The high demand for the dollar is largely driven by the fact that oil transactions are conducted in dollars, which is why China has sought to forge closer ties with Saudi Arabia in the hope that it will join Russia, Venezuela, and Iran in accepting the yuan for oil transactions. China is a much bigger oil importer than the United States that has significantly increased its production and reduced its dependence on foreign producers. This gives China greater leverage to set the conditions in this market and reach agreements so that its currency is accepted in exchange for crude oil as the first part of the plan. However, the plan would not be very effective if Saudi Arabia or other countries that agree to sell crude oil and other resources to China in yuan later convert those yuan into dollars. This is where the second part of the plan comes into play, which involves increasing the use of the yuan through the digital yuan and a network of digital currencies that aims to bring in more central banks, making it easier for countries to use the yuan they receive from crude oil sales to purchase other goods and services from countries within this network. But since these countries tend to be net exporters, or, in other words, what they import is less in value than what they export, they are left with a surplus of money, which historically has been in dollars and has been invested in the United States financial markets, which by having this constant inflow of money are more developed and liquid, being able to absorb large amounts of money without causing large movements, in one of the virtuous circles that I mentioned a moment ago. And for this reason, China will begin to open up its financial markets so that the Gulf countries initially and those that join later can invest the surpluses with which they remain in yuan and China's financial markets. On the other hand, China aims to increase the liquidity of the yuan and make it a more widely used currency. Just as it is common for companies and countries to seek resources in the United States and thereby demand dollars, China will seek to do the same with the yuan, and to facilitate this, China's central bank has established currency swap lines, allowing central banks to access liquidity in yuan. If Xi Jinping succeeds in his plan, some of the consequences for the United States could be a lower demand for the dollar and, by extension, higher inflation, a higher cost of borrowing for the country, companies, and individuals, creating lower spending capacity, with the proportions obviously depending on how successful it is. But is it realistic to think that he can do it? To do so, Xi will have to overcome several obstacles. The first one is obvious and is convincing as many countries as possible to accept yuan and keep it or use it for trade and investment, and not just receive it but exchange it for dollars or another currency. The second obstacle is the size of its financial markets, which, although they have increased significantly in recent years, are still much smaller compared to the ones of the United States. The stock market is 3 to 4 times larger, and the debt market is up to 10 times larger in the United States compared to China, which allows it to absorb more volume without affecting the price and generating extra costs. And this raises several questions, the first of which is how willing the Chinese government is to open its markets so that they can be attractive and develop enough to absorb large amounts of money. Japan and China have been able to invest a lot of money in the US by buying government debt, corporate debt, and even landmark companies and buildings, but at what level would China be willing to allow the same? The second question is related to some of the policies that China has implemented, such as strict control over the price of its currency so that it does not increase too much in price, affecting the competitiveness of its export sector, as well as strict capital control so that the money stays in China and cannot be easily withdrawn. But how willing would Xi Jinping be to allow money to freely flow in and out of the country in order to make it more attractive to investors? And how willing would he be to tolerate a loss of export competitiveness due to an appreciation of the yuan? The third obstacle is that many countries that feel uneasy with the power of the dollar and, as a result, the power of the United States over them are not necessarily going to switch their concerns from the US to China. Instead, they are considering alternatives to these two options so that they don't end up with the same concerns under a different power. For all this, for the moment the dollar is not as threatened by China as by the United States itself, which has abused its position by exceeding its spending and is now facing two problems that we have mentioned in two previous videos. The first of these is the debt ceiling, which although it is likely to be lifted so the country can borrow more and avoid a default, is still a risk that if it materialized, would lead to an unprecedented financial catastrophe. The second is the risk that the Federal Reserve loosens its monetary policies too soon and triggers a higher inflation that requires even higher rates to control it, as happened in the 1970s, but with a huge difference in the size of the US debt that would make the process extremely complex. If you found this information helpful, you may also enjoy this video. See you next time.